All right, on this next one, we're talking the standard of care, which is uh, actually, even though it sounds sort of um, plain, is actually an important contractual legal term. And so the standard of care, the general standard of care, is the thing that's in the contracts that says what level, uh, let's see, how do you describe it? What the level of legal care you are required to give to a client, to the public, to a project. And the usual way of talking about this is, and some of you have probably heard this before, that the standard of care for most architectural projects is that you did the work in a similar way as any other normal architect in a similar situation doing a similar type of project in a similar location would do. So the standard of care is not about, hey, we're going to provide the most beautiful building ever or the most sustainable building ever. The point of the standard of care is that it gives a place when something goes wrong. Is there a way to understand whether it was something that the architect really should have known? Like, it's the kind of thing that a normal architect doing a similar thing in a similar place with a similar building type would have understood. Well, then you should know. If it was something that just came out of the blue and there was really no way to know it, and a normal architect in the same situation, et cetera, wouldn't likely know that, then that wouldn't be something that would be considered part of the standard of care. So this is the standard of care is this kind of important line that gets drawn on all of these different kinds of legal topics, and usually it's only being drawn if something has gone wrong. So there's sort of an understanding that you're going back to the contracts to understand when something has happened that's gone badly, how do we make sure this is going to work out okay? Like the right people get blamed for a problem.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that too, I think something that's important to note with this standard of care is that the contract nor the profession expect anyone to be perfect 100% of the time. I think somewhere in one of those AI contracts, it mentions that you need to practice professionally and with competency and ask questions when you need to, but you're not a soothsayer. You can't read the future if costs are going to escalate and you under-calculated or under-quoted something. You don't have to be perfect at all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have to be able to see through drywall to see what's inside a wall. You don't have to be able to see underground. There's lots of examples of that. But you should be bringing a certain knowledge base to the building typology, to the situation, to the landscape, to the context, to the way the contracts work. But that level of sort of knowledge that you're bringing is a level of competency. It's not the level of perfection. It's not the level of beauty. It's not the level of that. You're contractually bringing competency and any way that you might read that. One of the examples I always give I simplify it from my actual life, but I had a similar thing to this, but I'll make it a little simpler. Imagine you're an architect and you're working on a project and it's at a corner, a busy sort of suburban corner, and you know that there used to be a gas station there. And you design the project, you have your drawings done, you get your permits, you do all that stuff, and they start digging into the ground, and oh my gosh, look at that, there's an old oil tank that now we have to deal with from an environmental standpoint. Should you have known, like you can't see into the ground, but you probably should have known enough to say, hey, there used to be a gas station here. Have we done an appropriate environmental report? Have people done the investigations? Like, it's not necessarily the architect's role to do that, but to be sort of understanding of what a likely thing would be there. If you knew there was a gas station there, there's a pretty good chance there's some environmental issues around there. Now take that exact same story and then put it out into it's an old farm field. You're, building a housing development or something like that, and they start digging, and they come across an old oil tank underneath this farm field. Well, there's really no possible way that you would have known that that was there. And so that's completely ridiculous. There's no way you should be sort of sued for that or anything. Like, that would be just impossible for you to have foreseen. So it's the same thing in the same location, but the context matters, right? If it's a situation where you're bringing enough knowledge base that a competent person should be able to say, something might be there, something's up with that, so it's not about the fact that there's a tank in the ground. It's about the context. It's about the contract. It's about what you've said, how you said who is going to take care of environmental issues in the contract. So it's the context around the issue that is what the question is going to be about. Because there is never a situation, like almost nothing can you say, whose fault is it if there's a tank in the ground, right? It's always more complex than that, and it's always about the context. So the standard of care is just sort of understanding where the architect is in that context.
Sharon, I think it's interesting too, you dropped that word sue, Mike, and I know now that there are a lot of people that are even licensed architects, or even you'll find a building official, that they don't want to approve a set of drawings, or they don't want to stamp a set of drawings because they don't want to take on that liability that everyone is sue happy and can come after you.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of important to note too that, you can't, sure, someone could open up a lawsuit, but there are a lot of different steps underneath the standard of care that need to be proven before something can go to that extreme.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things to say is that when you talk about legal issues, lawsuits and things like that, there's many steps that happen before anybody really gets to the idea of the standard of care. Should you even be named? Or do the people suing have standing to sue? All of those kinds of things. And most of the time, things actually get worked out through mediation or arbitration or some other thing that don't actually ever go to a litigation type trial. And that's most of the time a good thing for architects. Not always. There are situations where that's not true. But essentially, the idea that you kind of reduce the time it takes and the cost of lawyers and all of that stuff almost always is better going to mediation and arbitration. But these things come up all the time, but hardly ever play themselves out. I bet in my years I've been threatened to be sued probably, I don't know, 15 times, and actually been part of a suit, I don't know, 3, something like that. And then of the 3, none of them have ever nothing's ever come of it. So again, kind of that not perfect thing. Just the fact that you're not trying to not get sued. You're just trying to be aware of the process of the legal understanding, the legal context, and where the architect sits in that, so that you don't accidentally take on more liability than you meant to. So, for example, I heard an interesting thing at the AIA conference a little while ago, where some lawyers were talking about how people had been adding writers onto their contracts to talk about that they would get them LEED Gold or LEED Platinum on their projects. And by being specific about it in the way that they had been, they were essentially promising something that they didn't have full control over, because so many other people, the GC, the owner, potentially the code officials, have a say in that you can't really guarantee contractually before a project has started that you can guarantee somebody a LEED Platinum building. And so that's an example of sort of understanding the kind of the standard of care is saying, reasonableness, understanding that you're not perfect, but that you're able to sort of be competent, right? And then if you start slipping in things that imply perfection, it can alter the contract in an important way, and then that becomes a problem down the road.
Mike, one question from the group.
Yeah.
The standard of care is found in what AIA contract, or is it in a contract?
Yeah, it's actually mentioned in essentially all of the contracts and described. I think it's in the A201 is where it's actually described. But on some of the contracts, it's, like a few of them, it's mentioned directly in the contract as well. And there's a little paragraph description. And the paragraph will sound almost exactly like what I just said. It's just slightly different wording, but similar location, similar typology, et cetera, et cetera.